Well, this is interesting. This person in front of you here is Ashley Quan. Now, Ashley is the manager of advocacy and network engagement for Feed Ontario, which is really a network of Ontario's food banks and some other fooding groups that are part of that. It used to be called the Ontario Association of Food Banks and went through a name change a number of years ago. But Ashley has kindly consented to come and talk to us. And I think it's important, Ashley. We had Kirsten Beardsley from Food Banks Canada on a couple of times, but she's
hmm
told us about the national situation when it comes to food banks and what they're facing and what they hope some of their future plans will be. This session will be basically about Ontario and the
Yeah.
challenges that food banks are facing. And of course, many have just gone through their spring food drive, as we have just done.
hmm
Also, the month of March is Hunger Count, where all the food banks cooperate together with their data and statistics. So, but why don't you just give us a quick overview of what Feed Ontario is, how many organizations are in it, and how is it that you're structured?
Yeah. So Feed Ontario is a grassroots organization. So we are comprised of around, it changes a little bit, about 140 direct members, which are in pretty much every municipality in the province. And then through them, they have affiliate members, so smaller agencies, food pantries, breakfast clubs, school programs, that sort of thing. So we have about 1,100 affiliate members throughout the province.
Yeah.
So we provide food, resources, and advocacy and research on a provincial level to our membership.
Yeah. Actually, Jane and I were there at the beginning all of those years ago when just 4 or 5 Ontario food banks were meeting trying to figure out what are we going to do. This would be back in 1986, 1987.
hmm
And back in those days, Montreal also would come and join us to be part of it because they did not have an association in Quebec yet. But it was we were just trying to figure out how do we structure ourselves. We all knew that we could take on the operations in our local communities, but the whole idea that we needed to network to understand what's going on in other parts of the province, and in that case Quebec as well, we just instinctively understood, even though we were all just learning, we instinctively understood that this challenge of hunger and food insecurity that we were facing was really a provincial one. And then
hmm
as the time went on, and we had other food banks from Canada come to London, to the University of Western Ontario, and from that we founded the Food Banks Canada. It was very much aware that it was a national problem that we were all facing, and I know
hmm
that's it's really true. But for you now, you've got way more member agencies that you have to help with, and I know you do network engagement and also advocacy. But what is your role exactly when it comes to those kind of members like ourselves? What is it that you do?
Yeah. So my role was created around 2 years ago, specifically because there was this growing desire within our membership for more advocacy. We always say whenever we do our survey of our membership, the two things that they always want more of is more food and more advocacy. And so we had, tried to think about how we would go about that. Would we, hire maybe like a GR firm who specializes in that kind of thing? And we talked to our members, and they said, well, what we really want is to be able to do more advocacy ourselves. Because we're really connected in our communities, and we just need the tools, we need the resources, we need those opportunities. We need someone to take care of a lot of that legwork for us so that we can go out and talk to people who are make the decision makers and be able to tell them what the situation is on the ground.
Yeah.
Because we find that, a lot of our food banks don't have the sort of staff capacity and resources to be able to do a lot of this work on our own. And because of systems like Link to Feed, we can consolidate a lot of that work for them. So that's how my role was born. I've been with Feed Ontario for almost 8 years now. And I sort of slowly moved into it by doing more and more stuff in this portfolio. So when, our food bank said we want more of these tools and resources, I happen to already be creating a lot of them through my capacity doing marketing and events and that sort of thing. So I transitioned into this role. And now what I do is I co-write, or I think this year I'm just writing by myself, our annual hunger report, which is a look at the food bank use trends over the past year, and what we're seeing, what demographic changes there are, what explanations there might be for why these changes are happening, and our own policy recommendations. Again, I provide those tools and resources to our members. So that's something like our tool, Hunger in My Riding, where we took food bank use data and then split it up by provincial riding and provided a whole bunch of other stats. And then it's an easy to use tool where people can go and put in their provincial riding, their federal riding, their city and their region. And it spits out, a ready-made report for you of, what food bank use looks like in your community, what, average rents are and how they compare to social assistance, that sort of thing. And then I also do government relations work. So I talk to MPPs about food bank use, what the drivers of it are, and what our policy recommendations are and how we can make change.
Yeah. So I want to circle back to advocacy in a sec, but let's talk about that hunger count report. I mean, I think that what you just said about that individual food banks, could use some help when it comes to things like advocacy or other things, communications and other things. And obviously you have the skills to do that. But I also think that we're all very much aware as individual food banks that we can do that all we want. And it's very important, and we need to do it in our communities. But we all know that really the decisions on key pieces around hunger are actually decided at a provincial level, right? So it's really important for us, if we are going to advocate locally, we can do that till the cows come home and not have as much effect if we could combine that with the provincial effort, which is really what Feed Ontario does. Now, we were up with you about a month ago. Jane and I were in Toronto at Queen's Park. And annually, you have a breakfast and with members of Parliament and members of provincial Parliament, and also some cabinet ministers whoever comes in. And we were up there with you, but it was the first time really being able to do it since the pandemic. It's a yearly event, but the pandemic had kind of put that on hold for a while. Did you sense, Ashley, this time when you were there, a difference between this one that we did just a month ago with the various food banks meeting with politicians compared to what it was maybe like 3 or 4 years previously prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, the last one we had was 2018. And I would say, yeah, I did notice a big difference. I think part of it was that we had tried to design the event so that there were more opportunities for more policy-based discussions to really dig into what food banks are seeing as the barriers to people moving out of poverty. And to being able to share their own experiences. Because I think sometimes with events where it's just a bit of a meet and greet, you don't get down to the meat of things because you're just chatting with people. And I think a lot of people, when approaching an MPP, aren't as confident if it's not a facilitated discussion. But I think also in terms of the tenor of things, I mean, we all know food bank use has been rising for like a very long time. It's not a new trend. It's been going up basically every year since I want to say 2016, pretty consistently. And even then, there's never been really big drops. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is a really dramatic increase in food bank use. And I think a lot of food banks are they're tired and they're frustrated because they feel like they've been fighting the same battles, trying to raise awareness of what's going on, and while also serving on the front lines, and with these demands upon food banks and uh, it's just becoming so much worse. So I think there's a larger appetite for pushing a little bit harder.
Yeah. I mean, we were there with you. I sensed a real difference. I sensed a sense of urgency and
Hmm.
almost like things were ominous. There was a
Yeah,
quietness there that had not been there before. And I think a couple of things that came out of it for me was there were a couple of people that use food banks that actually spoke out. One of them was on disability, and they talked about just how hopeless it was to be able to negotiate moving into the future and to navigate uh, being that the economic situation was what it was. And I think that the second thing that was really important is food banks were saying to the politicians, you can't do this anymore. You constantly depend on us as food banks to take on, the increases that happen within communities, and you go on, you do policy about other things, but really when it comes to food insecurity or things like that, you really need to step up and start doing policies that affect that. Now, sometimes those
absolutely.
policies are directly about food, but sometimes they're about provincial programs, support programs, things like Ontario Disability or things like Ontario Works.
Hmm.
Those things are really important. And I think what I sense from food banks, I sense it within myself at that breakfast was those are the things that are outside of us. Our communities are great and they're responding and they're helping as much as they can. But if people haven't seen a support payment increase in 10 years, then what's going to happen? Right? The numbers just continue to climb. I really sense that that carried a lot of weight with politicians. You're not going to have us to kick around forever the way that you have in the past, right? Right now, you're in charge of social programs, which is largely what's driving a lot of the crisis we're going through. Did you have that sense?
Absolutely, yeah. The way we frame it, oftentimes, is that we see food banks as, the emergency rooms of the social safety net. So, in a more ideal world, food banks would be there for the in-betweens when, say, you lose your job and you need to apply for EI or for Ontario Works, and there's delays in your paperwork and you're waiting for your application to go through. Maybe you don't have enough to get by, so you go visit a food bank and it bridges that gap for you, and then you're fine. Or maybe you've just moved here, you're getting back on your feet, um, and trying to build a life, and food banks are there to help you get started, because it's a very community based response, and it can be, I think, in a lot of ways more nimble and responsive to individual needs than a big government program can be. But the problem that we're seeing is that governments, like you said, are using it as a way to subsidize their own austerity measures. Corporations are using it to subsidize, a lack of wage increases, so that, all these people who aren't getting by, they actually refer them to food banks. You can go to an Ontario Works office and they'll say, well, you don't have enough to make ends meet. So maybe you should just use this charity program, because our program isn't designed to be able to live on. Um,
Yeah.
and we find that 2/3 of people who use food banks in Ontario rely on Ontario Works or on the Ontario Disability Support Program. We can't, fix everyone who may be experiencing tough times, but those are two big programs that make up the vast majority of people using food banks. And if we can raise those rates and make them more in line with the cost of living, um, then I think we can take a big chunk and a lot of pressure off of food banks, so that they are better able to do more what they're meant to do, instead of subsidizing the government.
Yeah, that's really important, I think, because ODSP hasn't had an increase in a decade. Now, it has a little bit of thing about somebody who earns some, they're able to keep a little bit more, but it's nothing. It's very negligible. But that's what people on disability have had to face for a decade. Ontario Works is the same. It's been about a decade. In BC, for instance, they haven't had any increases in their program since 2007. Now, for years, food banks, their major group that was coming to them were always people more or less from those sectors, people that were running into difficulty as it became clear over the years that they weren't having the support payments that could keep up with the standard of living that was there. They were ending up running out of money much earlier in the month than they had before. I think that that was really clear. But now it's almost at epidemic levels, right? Where people on those kind of programs, like we often ask people just here in London, like, what would it be like if you made the same amount of money you did a decade ago?
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to pay for the grocery rent, the grocery costs that have gone up, or rental costs that have mushroomed. It couldn't be done, and yet that's what governments are expecting people on programs to do. And I think always in the past, whenever we had a recession, food banks were born in a recession, and they've had to respond during recessions. But the numbers would go up during a recession, and after the recession was over, they never really did decline. They plateaued.
Yeah.
They just hung in there. They lingered until the next recession, and then they went up again. Now, we've had a
Mm-hmm.
series of that over the last 3 decades, with the Great Recession as well. And now with COVID, we're seeing it again. And it seems to me that that major group that was coming to food banks are no longer able to cope, and they're falling out of the bottom. And many of them are becoming homeless or really needing other
Mm-hmm.
kinds of help. But I presume that's what the data is showing to you in Hunger Count and other things, is it? That those groups that are traditional people that come to us for help are really under serious assault.
Um, Yeah, so it's a bit complicated. So I would say that ODSP did receive a 5% increase to rates last year, and it was legislated to increase with inflation each year. That being said, both OW and ODSP are significantly lower when you account for inflation and that sort of thing than they were even, in 1995 after all those cuts happened, and they were cut by something like 30% from what they were, and then they were frozen for many years, and then slightly increased, and then frozen again for another 4 years. Ontario Works has had no increase over the last since I guess 2018. So that's gotten much worse, especially because they started. They're only $733, which is nothing. So I think that's important. I think the ODSP piece, as meager as it is of an increase, 5% wasn't even enough to cover inflation for that year. That was sort of born out of advocacy,
Yeah.
of a lot of people pushing for that change. And I think that is a minor victory, I guess, because I think if people hadn't been pushing for it, and speaking with one voice, that nothing would have happened, and we'd be even in a worse position today.
Yeah.
And I think also there's also a lot of talk about the cost of living crisis in terms of food prices, and obviously everyone's feeling that crunch. Food banks are too in terms of buying supplies, but we also know that housing is a big portion of that. That so many people who are visiting food banks. We did a survey, I think 2 years ago, where something like 2/3 of people visiting a food bank had less than $100 left after paying for their housing and their rent. So really, at that point,
Yeah.
your food going up is not that nearly as big of a deal as your housing taking up so much of your living costs. But to your point about the food bank data, we are seeing like definitely just a growth overall. I think that one of the fastest growing populations is actually people with employment, because we're seeing that jobs really aren't supporting people very well these days, or people are trying to patch together a lot of different things. Certainly, I think not to get too like in the weeds, but with OW and ODSP, I don't know if it's growing quite as fast as we would have expected. But if you look at the provincial numbers, the actual programs aren't growing as fast as you would expect either. So I'm not sure if it's some sort of like intake issue where people aren't even qualifying for Ontario Works or ODSP, to be able to put that when they come to us in their intake to say that their primary source of income. They're just sort of skipping that safety net and going straight into poverty. But in terms of the homelessness, I don't know if our food bank data is necessarily capturing it because just of the way that we run it doesn't capture, I think, all of the programs that food banks always run, because a lot of what food banks do to support people who are unhoused are outside of traditional food banks services because there's more meal programs and that sort of thing. But anecdotally, we know that our food banks are definitely telling us that there's a huge spike, and it's happening all over the province. It's not exclusive to big cities. Small towns are saying that they're experiencing it too. It just looks a little bit different. You see a lot of people. I know at our MPP breakfast, someone was saying that a lot of tradespeople live in their trucks because they can't afford rent. One of the others was saying they had previously, I think, given away like 25, like they had these takeaway bags, specifically like things that are easy to eat that don't need preparation for people who are visiting who are homeless. And that was, a couple of years ago, and now they're up to 200 a month.
Yeah.
So it's really escalating. We're seeing pressures everywhere. I think, with the rising housing prices all over the province, with, I think, also the movement of people out of cities during the pandemic and into smaller cities, and then from smaller cities into small towns, the challenge has just been sort of diffused everywhere.
So you picked, the real challenge for us now is food banks, and we're really feeling the crunch in the last number of months. I know in Hunger Count 2022, I think, so this is Hunger Count from last year, the Hunger Count saw a 66% increase in the number of first-time users.
Mm-hmm.
That's really significant. Now, it wasn't quite that high in London, but the point was we weren't used to that. We were used to trying to handle, traditional populations that were coming in and getting help. But it really became clear after the pandemic kind of receded that things were not going to go back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden now, all of these new people were coming. You've mentioned about, work and people having trouble making enough to keep up with the standard of living. That's true. And many are coming to us for other reasons as well. Groups like students and seniors. There's been an increase in seniors coming to us as well that we weren't really expecting. Do you see that trend continuing now a year later, since that came out in 2022 and we've just finished Hunger Count 2023? Do you see that continuing?
That's a great question. We haven't run the numbers yet for our next hunger report, but we're definitely still seeing really big increases month over month. I was just looking at the aggregate data the other day for the whole network, which doesn't, break it down into first-time users and that sort of thing. But there is really like no slowing down of this trend for sure. It's just going up and up and up. Very, very steep increases. And it's very concerning. And I would expect that it would come from, every corner. There's not one that I think has really experienced that much relief in the last year. So I wouldn't expect demographics to shift very dramatically. But I guess that'll see when we run the numbers and do that analysis.
Yeah. Seems to me that we're not really seeing an end to
No,
the
no.
increases that are coming and are continuing to do so. But we might see an end to food banks being the group that can manage that. Correct? I mean, it seems to me that food banks are largely donor based, right? And they
Mhm.
depend on the generosity of donors. And donors have been so great across Ontario. Businesses, associations, faith groups, they've all stepped up when they have needed to. But they too now are having to pay more for accommodation costs. They're having to pay more for rent, more for groceries. It's not easy. And if we're going to continue to have a system that largely gets by on donations, then at some point you hit a ceiling. And it
Hmm.
seemed to me at the MPP breakfast there a month ago, I think that the two MPPs that Jane and I spoke with both got that sense from that meeting that we might not be able to count on this happening anymore. Some kind of crisis could take place unless something is done to ameliorate some of those pressures that food banks are facing. Do you get that sense, or do you think that food banks are able to continue to go on and handle it and absorb even more of the pressure and demand that's being placed on them? You're better in touch with that than I am.
That's a great question. I think uh, overall not sustainable. I think different food banks, depending on their funding models,
Yeah.
some are a bit less vulnerable to those sorts of things than others. Some food banks I think are luckier to have like a lot of industry in where they are, so they get more of those corporate donations, which are not as much not as pressured, I think, as individual donations are, whereas some of our other food banks are very maybe 80-90% of their revenue comes from individual donors. So when that cost of living increases hit, that really takes a hit on their ability to bring in those fundraising dollars. I was reading an interview that Daily Bread, I think, was doing the other day, that was talking about, or maybe it was Northrop Harvest, but either I was talking about their agencies, because they said, we're a centralized distribution center, so they have, paid staff, and they, can get that funding and can have people work on this full time to be able to distribute food across the city. But they themselves rely on agencies, and a lot of those agencies are heavily reliant, if not completely reliant, upon volunteer labor. They have much less resources in those smaller organizations. They're feeling the rent crunch as well. If they're paying market rent, their landlords might be increasing their rent, and they might not be able to keep up in quite the same way. And they're the ones who are on the front lines and seeing those huge lines, and just might not have the capacity to be able to handle this much demand, even if they do have more money and more food flowing through. There's all these other sort of factors that we're seeing, and yeah, I don't think that we can do this indefinitely, indefinite increases. Food banks, the Mississauga Food Bank just had to move to a larger warehouse space, just to be able to handle the increased demand upon their services over the last couple of years. So, but not everyone's able to do that. Mississauga, is in a place where there's a lot of opportunities for that kind of thing. But we know that some of our other food banks, I think it was Cambridge who was telling me that there was feeling, pressure because the area they were in was being redeveloped, so they might be, forced out for whatever reason, and to be able to pay rent in a new location was just might be unfeasible. So that was a real challenge that they were dealing with.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
Well, actually, we're out of time. That went fast.
oh
But
yeah, half an hour already.
30 minutes, yeah. I did want to say, though, that it's a bit like climate change. I think that we talk about it, we can blue box, we can grow in our garden, we can be careful what we throw out and everything, but we're very much aware that just as populations around the world, that unless policymakers do something more about it, we're all in serious trouble. And I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you have done. Very much in London, we're active, we're involved in these different things. But I came away from that MPP breakfast and thought, where would we be without Feed Ontario? We're not up in Queen's Park. We're not the ones that are having to speak to the politicians who daily are having to make these things, these decisions. I want to thank you for that. It's important for us to know that you're up there and doing that because we can't get there. We're too busy. But I think at the end of the day, that is where the solutions are ultimately going to lie. And I just want to thank you and Feed Ontario for giving it that kind of priority. Ashley, we really need that as individual food banks.